frankly, the legal battles have taken a financial toll on him.
Well, there is now less than 6 months to go until the US presidential election in November, a contest that many are calling one of the most consequential in generations. So who better to chew it all over with than one of America's most respected political journalists? Chuck Todd is NBC News' chief political analyst, a former host of Meet the Press, and the host of the brilliant Chuck Toddcast. Chuck, welcome to Times Radio.
Thank you, James. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to travel overseas without having to get on a plane.
Let's start with a big one. 6 months out, who is in a stronger position, Trump or Biden?
Oh, I think Donald Trump's in a much stronger position. And there's different ways you can look at it. It's not that he's that much stronger. It's that Joe Biden's in a pretty weak position right now. And I think that's I talk about it this way. The country has decided it would like to fire Biden, but it does not want to rehire Trump. And that's sort of where we're stuck, right? The public fired Trump once. I think they thought the deal, and I've always thought this, that the last voters, when I refer to the deal, I always look, we know where 90% of voters are, but the last voters that put Biden over the top, I think the deal they thought they were cutting with Biden was twofold. One, he was going to sort of turn the temperature down, get rid of the chaos, and frankly, turn the page on Trump, that this was our way to get rid of Trump. And start to bring the country together. We're 3.5 years in. The country's not been brought together. Trump's still here. Is that Joe Biden's fault? I think it depends on what you think he could have done. I think if he were a stronger leader, perhaps people wouldn't be thinking, well, maybe I should go back to Trump. So maybe it is on him. On the other hand, there are forces out of his control. You have a Republican Party that clearly is divided amongst itself. It's a much more divided party than the Democratic Party. Although if Biden loses, watch for a very divisive fight over recriminations on that. So, and certainly, look, let's talk about how media is consumed, right? That is another, but there's multiple realities you have to speak to now in our political discourse, and I think Biden can't break through some of these places, just break the barriers of, and whether is that on us? Is that on big tech? Is that on, I've got strong opinions on that, but I think that's also been a contributing factor here. And of course, there's outside forces, right? We know that the Russians and the Chinese would love nothing more than to see us divided amongst ourselves because it weakens us internationally. And on that score, it's interesting. America's been simultaneously looking stronger and weaker at the same time in its international leadership, right? And that is I think that is becoming, frankly, a norm and that's a little disconcerting.
If you're looking at the challenges for Donald Trump, and I want to come on to his legal problems in a moment, but his finances, what is the state of his campaign finances?
They're very behind. I mean, in many cases, he had a small donor advantage for some time. And the ability to just use any, but he bled that dry. When you're begging people for $10 checks every day, and then you start doing it multiple times a day, you get donor fatigue, particularly with the small donor. That's clearly there. He's been, nonstop raising money from them ever since he's been contesting the election and then contesting his legal battles. And frankly, the legal battles have taken a financial toll on him as well, and he's been trying to get the campaign and the Republican Party to essentially share the costs, if not pay for all of it. It's a real thing. I do think the organizational difference between the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign is night and day. But let me give you a dirty little secret. 4 years ago, the Trump campaign was the one that had the better organization. They were the one that were on the ground everywhere because the Biden campaign was being very COVID cautious. They were doing no door knocking. They had no major organizations. And money was about even. I do think Trump's catching up on money, but it's certainly going to be. Money's not going to decide this race. All right, money is not going to decide the presidential race, but it does. If this becomes a lower turnout contest, then that's where money matters. It's funny. The fewer voters, the more money matters. The more voters, the less money matters.
And of course, Donald Trump this week has his hush money case. We've seen Stormy Daniels testify this week. Of all his various legal cases, which one, if any, has the potential to really scupper his chances in November?
Well, I think all of them could. depending on his behavior and outcome. I've always believed the January 6th case, the one that's most directly linked to his behavior after the last election, is the most potent, is the most lethal to him politically. Because think about the visual of this, and I don't know if this trial is going to happen before November, but if it does, Mike Pence is going to testify. The former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, is going to testify. The former Chief of Staff, John Kelly, is going to testify. You're going to have all these people that are, Mark Meadows is going to testify, another former Chief of Staff. You're going to have all these these aren't going to be Democrats leveling charges against Donald Trump. It's going to be people he hired, people that worked for him that are going to do this. So, if you recall the January 6th committee hearings that Liz Cheney ran over here 2 years ago, and you remember the videos of these Trump administration officials, what they were saying, well, imagine that in a courtroom, and imagine that even though we wouldn't be physically seeing it on camera, every day we would know what was being said, and these would be people, fellow Republicans, essentially saying he's unfit for office, and here's what he didn't do to protect the country, to protect the Capitol. So I think that's why I've always believed that's the most lethal, because of who the witnesses are. This is Republicans basically testifying against Trump. All the other cases have a different type of political baggage to them, right? It feels like it's elected Democrats, which they are in both Georgia and New York, going after Trump. That's not the case with the January 6th case.
And does the January 6th case genuinely have the potential to swing votes? Because it seems to me from the outside like most Americans must have made up their mind about Trump already. You've got enough evidence already.
James, it's an interesting debate. I had Stan Greenberg, who was the first pollster for Bill Clinton back in the day, in the 90s, and sort of a longtime Democratic pollster. He believes this democracy message, essentially the January 6th message, doesn't work to persuade any voters. Because in his mind, I think, and I think you're hinting at this, I tend to agree. I think if this is a concern for you, I imagine you've already made up your mind, right? So the question you got to ask yourself is, who's left that could be persuaded, and what issues are front of mind for them? And what Stan would say is it's all about the economy, right? The remaining voters that are up for grabs, they're not going to be persuaded by January 6th. They may have an opinion about it, but that isn't their front of mind issue. But there is a part of me that thinks January 6th could really, what it would really hurt is it could hurt Republican enthusiasm, right? And it could have an impact on sort of soft Republicans who don't want to vote for Biden, but maybe they skip the race. And that's where I think it could have real impact on the Trump vote.
It is interesting how, if you rewind the clock back 18 months, a lot of people thought Donald Trump was in a very weak position after the 2022 midterms. People thought Ron DeSantis would potentially be the Republican nominee. And really, the moment he started having all these cases stacking up against Trump, you saw his poll numbers go up. Do you think the Democrats and the prosecutors made a mistake in feeding into Trump's narrative that he wants to push, that this is a witch hunt against him?
There are so many ways to look back on this one, right? And think about the roads that were not taken. There's a reason the federal government didn't try to prosecute the case that the New York City is trying to prosecute against Trump. It's very difficult. They don't have to prove that Trump paid the hush money. They have to prove that he did it in order to influence the election. It's a very high standard. And, the federal government's had a hard time making political convictions stick. They've had a couple of them overturned by the Supreme Court. So the Justice Department's been it's very difficult to prove that exact piece. You don't have there's no paper trail. You have to use circumstantial evidence there a little bit. And so maybe our common sense would say, well, of course, but, there's certainly some relevance that he may have paid her off to protect his marriage, right? Which is, as long as that's there and some jurors think that's possible, that's enough potentially for reasonable doubt, depending on the judge's instructions, I think, on that one. But I do think you get the larger point is this. Yes, it felt like a pile-on. And I think if you were unpack all of this, I put a lot of blame on this situation on the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. He dragged his feet on the January 6th investigation. They were quote unquote methodical. We're going to start from the bottom up. Well, by starting from the bottom up, you sort of and putting off and putting off, it allowed Trump to start to dictate the calendar of the case. So, for instance, and what people don't realize is, why did Donald Trump announce in November of 2022, one of the weirdest times to announce for president? Because he knew that justice was close with coming in an indictment, and he wanted to, quote, slow that process down. And he knew if he were an active candidate that Merrick Garland would have to appoint a special counsel, which would also slow down the process. Well, why did Garland wait so long? Right? And he basically, they don't believe this is true, but I'm sorry. I'm an Occam's razor guy. I know what I saw. I don't think they were ever going to bring a case against Trump until the January 6th committee uncovered all this other evidence. And had they done their own legwork on the electors, and they done, maybe this is being brought against Trump in spring of 22 and the summer of 22, rather than spring, fall of 22, then into spring of 23. And then it did feel like the presidential campaign. And oh, by the way, then you had the Georgia, this very Byzantine way that she's trying to prosecute Trump down there, and sort of creating this larger conspiracy in order to sort of sweep up, 20 or 30 people into the conspiracy to overturn the Georgia election. So, and then the classified documents case, on its own, he should be held to the same standard that we've held others to. But boy, compared to everything else we've seen, you're like, really, we're pursuing that too? Unless you have proof he used that intelligence to make money off of it or to sell some secret, this is going to be one of those where you handed some people speeding tickets and you put some people in jail. That is going to be hard for the public to discern what was more serious than not. So so if you were to ask me the initial mistake, it's Merrick Garland, and it's his decision to essentially, I don't think they were going to do it. And Liz Cheney's committee was just too effective and they couldn't ignore it.
Does this set a dangerous precedent, though? I mean, were Trump to win in November, would he then use so-called lawfare, as you often hear these days, to go after his opponents in the Democratic Party and say, look, they did it to me, I'm just getting my own back?
I think he's going to try in some cases. We'll see. I think sometimes with Trump, he says things and then his mind will change later. But I think he is going to try to build an administration that is much more in his mold. One of the things that I think we don't fully appreciate is how much his first 2 years, his worst instincts were stymied by the people around him. And they were able, and he didn't know how to build a government, and he relied on some very responsible people that made sure he was hiring responsible people. Well, he now knows, he has said this, I'm not going to make that same mistake. He believes that was a mistake. So I think he is going to have a more pliant cabinet. He's going to have U.S. attorneys that are very much more politically engaged, that are looking, to make their way in MAGA. So I think it's going to be I do think you're going to see a lot of sort of what I would call retribution, if you will, on that front, tit for tat. And I, we can sit here and say, is this, when did this start? Who started this tit for tat in sort of criminalizing politics, right? And who's taken this too far? Some people would go back to the Clinton impeachment, right? That this began sort of this partisan sort of weaponizing of the legal system in order to make gains politically.
I want to come on to Biden in a moment, but just on Trump, it's really interesting. He did an interview, much publicized interview with Time magazine last week, where he talked about the lessons he learned from his first term and what his prospectus would be for his second term. And there's lots in it, but specifically he talks about things like wanting to deport 11 million people, build migrant detention camps, deploy the US military on the border and inland. He'd allow Republican states to monitor women's pregnancies and prosecute those who violate abortion bans. He would fire any US attorney who doesn't carry out his order to prosecute someone. And he's considering pardons for all of those involved in January the 6th. I mean, I suppose for someone like you, Chuck, over recent years, it's hard to be shocked. But when you read that interview, what was your reaction?
Well, I think the fact that he's so comfortable saying it, But just think about that. This is not, and I think this is the reality. I always say I'm stuck covering politics as it is, not as I wish it were. And this is what half the country thinks. Maybe 40%. Okay, not quite half, but let's say 35 to 40% of the country. Is this because of our broken information ecosystem? Yes, a little bit. Is this because elites are sometimes pretty out of touch? Yeah, that too. Frankly, I also think our news industry is also creating a wider divide. Every time I see a new high-end news service, I'm thinking, great, another concierge news service for the rich, and for the wealthy and for the well-to-do. But, this is why, people that are just trying to make ends meet feel as if, hey, no one understands my problems. No one understands this. So, I think that there's something to that, right, of this out of touch. But the fact that he can say these things and, now even supposed mainstream members of the Republican Party, they may think it's crazy, but they don't have the guts to say anything publicly, because if they did, they'd be canceled inside their party and they'd probably be out of a job.
And does Trumpism die with Trump? If you got rid of the man, would the same style of politics still go on? Even though you've seen Ron DeSantis, for example, try and adopt elements of the MAGA agenda, he is actually a very different type of politician. Is this unique to Trump the man, or is it a broader thing?
Look, I think the idea that Trump goes away and everything goes back to the way, to the Mitt Romney days of the Republican Party is pretty Pollyannish and pretty naive. I do think if you remove Trump, there's at least a debate about which direction the party should go, because they have a real ideological divide. I mean, particularly on capitalism, on the basic thing like trade. You have half the party. I don't know if half the party really is in favor of tariffs, or because Trump's in favor of tariffs, they're just going to be in favor of tariffs, right? So that's why I ask, what happens when you remove him? There's still going to be a debate about this, right? Economic nationalism versus open free trade. Well, the Republican Party I grew up with did not they thought the Democratic Party was associated with sort of that of nationalizing the economic nationalism, protect jobs and, keep the Japanese from taking our jobs back in the 80s, for instance, when we saw this sort of ideological divide continue to grow. And now, of course, all of this is, understandably after the Great Recession, a lot of people sort of reoriented themselves, and certainly a lot of people inside the Republican Party. So I think there would be a robust debate inside the party without Trump. But the other thing that I think he's changed us for a long time is our tactics. I mean, we really have, made going low a high form of politics now. It's like the general conversation is to denounce. The general way to discuss politics is to refer to the other party as an enemy, right? Refer to the other party as un-American. That's just now the norm. That's not going away when Trump goes away. And so we really have created a situation where the two parties do feel like they're at war with each other. And you have two cultures, right? Trump basically figured out how to hijack the Republican Party using culture. But the cultural divide was already there, right? He just was able to weaponize it. And probably more effectively than anybody's ever been able to weaponize culture. Joe McCarthy did it, but he didn't become president. George Wallace did it, but he didn't become president. This guy did it and he became president.
Let's talk about Joe Biden. I mean, I'll be honest, Chuck, I was slightly surprised. I know it is not normal at all for there to be a challenge to an incumbent president from within his own party when he's seeking re-election. But I was surprised there wasn't, other than Dean Phillips, who was a relatively, less well-known congressman. There was no significant challenge. And maybe this is because I'm speaking from the UK, and then if you've noticed, we have no issue chopping and changing leaders these days. But it was a bit surprising, I thought, that a Gretchen Whitmer or a Gavin Newsom or some big-name Democrat didn't come out and challenge Joe Biden. Did it surprise you?
It did when you look at it from 30,000 feet, right? It doesn't make any sense. You look at it from frankly recent American history. Presidents this week almost always get challenged in their own primary, in their own party. George H.W. Bush was this week, and he got a major primary challenge in Pat Buchanan back in the day. Jimmy Carter was weak. He got a major primary challenge back in the day. Richard Nixon got primary challenges from sitting members of Congress in 72. Lyndon Johnson in 68, it ended up driving him out of the race. So it was odd. Look, obviously it's Trump, right? The fact that Trump was sitting on the other side, what happened was the Biden campaign inside, they really did a good job on the inside part of the campaign, meaning they locked down the major donors. They made sure there was just no money out there for a primary challenger to tap into. It's also, right, successful primary challengers are usually ideologically driven. You're either from the right in the Republican side or from the left. And he really placated progressives as best he could to, there was really only one or two progressives that could have become a real thorn in his side if he wanted to be, and that's Sanders and Warren. And he did, Elizabeth Warren, the former senator, and Bernie Sanders, of course, and he did his best to keep them in the tent, right? He really managed in that sense. And they really sort of scared donors into saying, you're just going to help get Trump elected. And certainly what happened in 2016, right? The fact that Trump could lose the popular vote and still win the presidency, it was effective. And you had people like Gavin Newsom, who I think really wanted to primary him. And I think I think someday he will regret that he didn't do it. He didn't do it because he wanted a future in the Democratic Party. And a lot of those Democrats were basically told, you do this and you fail, and you're in Siberia for life. You're out of the party for life. You will be done. You will be a footnote, in history, and that's it. And I think it certainly had that. I've thought about, if Biden loses, I think he's going to be the most reviled person in the Democratic Party. I think the anger, I think the people are going to believe he was selfish. Because if he loses, ultimately it's going to be because of this perception of age and weakness that have sort of merged. I think some people think, boy, this is not the same. Biden would have been stronger on this if not for his age, right? There is a sense that Biden, he did this interview with CNN and he was asked about the Genocide Joe chants. And he just sort of let it go. Rather than saying, hey, that's ridiculous. And, oh, by the way, you know where this comes from? This comes from actually a misunderstanding of the history of the Middle East. But he didn't do either. He just sort of let it happen. He took the punch and slouched almost, right? And so he's really fed into this weakness narrative a little bit. But, it is going to be, you talked about before we got on, I like to do a lot of what ifs, alternative histories. Imagine butterfly flaps its wings, yada, yada, yada. Suddenly Donald Trump's president. I do think there's going to be a lot of what if scenarios if Biden loses.
It's so fascinating. I mean, look, there is a compelling case to be made, and I understand it as to why Biden may actually be the best Democrat to take on Trump. He's
the only one
once before.
Right.
Consistently underestimated throughout his career, has an appeal 100%. To blue-collar voters, so he needs to win over. I get all that. But his biggest flaw is the one thing he can't change. He can't make himself younger.
Right. And he's not a good communicator. There was a time he was a really good communicator. In a weird way, his run-on sentences, his penchant for talking too much was a feature. You always knew, I know how he's feeling about this. I know where he stands on this. And we haven't seen that version of him. And it does feel as if he's been protected a little bit. I don't, look, we all have older relatives who are all there, but they're slower in their response times. They're more methodical in how they want to say something. They gather their thoughts a second. Unfortunately, in this media environment, that doesn't look like that what you're doing, right? It can come across different if you're not careful. So I think that's been the issue, is that he's just not been a good communicator. They wait too long to come out. He waited too long on the campus protests. He always seems to wait about a week, 2 weeks too late to say something. It's almost like, and by the time he says it doesn't make an impact because, well, shoot, everybody else had said it in every other op-ed page in America.
It's interesting you mentioned the campus protests. I mean, there are two issues that potentially could swing it, I sense, for the Democrats, either in their favor or against. One that might help them win is abortion, and one that might potentially lose it is this issue over Gaza, because what for so long was a massive part of the Democrats' base, young progressive voters, they may simply stay home. How do you see those two issues playing out, Chuck?
Well, look, I do think the Gaza issue is a bit overcovered right now in its importance into the larger political. I mean, when you actually look at polling among young voters, listing all these issues, in Gaza was ninth. There were 8 other issues ahead of it. I think the bigger problem with young voters for Biden is this is an economy that isn't working very well for them. And that's what they're concerned about. The idea of buying a house looks way too far in the future for them to get there. So I do think that's, but I'll say this about about Israel and Gaza. If this is a hot war in the fall, I think this feeds into the Biden weakness narrative, right? This needs to be brought to some sort of cold truce in the fall, I think, for this not to be an issue. He cannot, if this is a hot war and the campuses come back, you're going to have, because look at what Biden did the other day. He basically admitted the campus protests had an impact on his policy. So that's only going to fuel organizers to say, let's keep it up. Let's keep it up in September when classes resume. So if this is a hot war. So I do think that ultimately, if it's not a hot war by the fall, if we've got some sort of uneasy peace, and I think I still keep thinking that everybody involved needs this to stop at some point, including Bibi. So, they need some sort of truce sooner rather than later. It's interesting you bring up abortion. There's a colleague of mine, runs another publication. She said something about 6 months ago, very definitively, and I thought she may be right, which was Republicans may not win another national election until abortion is resolved, right? And I think resolved, we know where the American public is. It's not a close call. This isn't a 50-50 issue, right? This is a 65-35 issue. It's just the problem is not inside the Republican Party. But even in the Republican Party, it's kind of a divisive issue. It's like maybe 60-40 the other way. So, but she thinks they can't win another national election, and it might be true. Abortion might be enough. I mean, that's what happened in 2022. Midterms normally are a place for voters to express their discontent at the sitting president. Well, our exit polls show they didn't like him. His job approval rating was way underwater, but Democrats overperformed. It was because of abortion. And a substantial number of people who said they had they disapproved of the job Biden did still voted for Democrats. So I think it tells you how powerful the abortion issue is. And I think the abortion issue allows them to say, this is the unintended consequences of gambling on a Donald Trump presidency, right? Nobody believed Hillary Clinton when she said, hey, Roe v. Wade might not be there with the Trump presidency. Well, now they know, hey, you don't know what's going to happen here. So that's why I think it's such a powerful message for them. It's not just on the issue itself, which does get young voters out, but it allows them to make that stronger case of, hey, what else is he going to do with 4 more years? Look at what happened in just his first 4 years. So that's why I think it potentially is that. But again, Biden becomes Carter with the Middle East if this is still a hot war in September and October.
On the abortion issue, it's been fascinating how Donald Trump has tried to grapple with his messaging on this, sensing how politically difficult it is. I just wonder, could this be the one issue that could lead parts of the Republican base to break with Trump? I mean, ever since 2016, people have said, what would it take for Trump loyalists to disown him? He famously said he could stand in Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, people would still support him. And, nothing that's happened since has really disproved that theory. But if he felt for electoral purposes to win the presidency, he had to significantly moderate his stance on abortion. Could that lead to a section of the evangelical right deserting him?
I don't know. It's certainly what they thought for back in 2016. He was petrified that evangelicals didn't trust him, which is why he outsourced his judiciary picks. He said, here's a list, you approve it. So they were very concerned about that 8 years ago. Now Trump's concerned the other way. He is concerned the other way. I don't think, it's funny. I don't know. Doesn't seem like anything Trump does shakes that base per se. So I don't think it would. I actually think he could bring them to a more a position that would be seen as more tolerant, even if it's not necessarily preferred. I've always thought Republicans don't fully understand. They're sitting there going, 15 weeks, 15 weeks, it's okay. And you're like, yeah, but that isn't what people will accept 15 weeks. They're not going to riot in the streets over 15 weeks, but they still would prefer the Roe standard of 24 weeks. And frankly, the standard that most people want is just leave it up to the person and the doctor. This is not a politician's decision. This is a medical professional's decision and the woman carrying the baby's decision, period.
You mentioned earlier this week's episode of the Toddcast is with Stan Greenberg, the Democratic pollster. And I know you talked briefly about how important the VP picks may be this time around. I know your theory is that they never really matter. But this time around, given the ages of the two candidates, do you think it may be different?
I think it only matters to voters. I only think it's a voting issue. And that's where I go back to. Is it a voting issue? I'm not saying people don't care about it, but will they actually vote on it? And like I said, look at all the evidence. We've had some terrible VP picks who've gotten embarrassed on debate stages, and the top of the ticket still won, right? I mean, Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, George H.W. Bush and Dan Quayle. Dick Cheney was unpopular, very unpopular, but that didn't matter. But if one of Trump or Biden has a health scare in September or October, and hello, we've had, I've covered campaigns. Bernie Sanders had a heart attack during during the campaign. Bill Bradley had a heart attack during the campaign. Let's see, a sitting president, Donald Trump, almost died from COVID during the campaign. If there's a health scare, then yes, then everything gets elevated. Then all of a sudden, it is potentially more relevant. But I think what Trump's looking for. Well, it's interesting. I personally think Trump's just looking for somebody that he believes is just simply going to help him win. That might be financial, which is why he's got a billionaire on his short list from North Dakota. Like, it doesn't make any sense unless you realize, if he's on the ticket, he can write more money to the campaign. If you can spend more of your personal money on a campaign if you're on the ticket. There's only so much he could write in checks. He's a billionaire, this Doug Burgum. So financially, I see, that's what Trump is thinking there. But I think there's another part of him that thinks, well, maybe if I have a diverse pick, a person of color, I can chip away among, say, Latino men or African-American men. Or does he need a woman to talk about abortion? Right. So I do think those are the three criteria he's sort of looking at. If you look at his short list, it's there. But ultimately, I don't think any of these, it really will not get front and center unless the health scare is put in front of the voters.
You don't think there's any chance that his actual priority will be to have someone who would do his bidding, that he doesn't want a repeat of what happened with Mike Pence, which is when he felt he needed him, Mike Pence, did his, democratic patriotic duty, but nonetheless broke with Trump?
Well, I do think this. What somebody close to him said to me is like, he's not going to worry about placating a group. And I think the Pence pick was about placating evangelicals. So I think but, in that sense, I think that he wants somebody, he certainly does want somebody who seems more loyal than Pence, but he thought Pence was pretty loyal, and Pence was loyal for 3 years and 352 days.
Let's talk about RFK Jr. briefly. Does he hurt Trump or Biden more?
Right now, he's none of the above. And it's hurt, and I think I'm one of those who believes it depends on the state. We have, in this case, and I know you probably do understand our electoral politics, but this is always, honestly, I don't always understand the parliamentary districts either over in your end of things. So but ultimately, there's a chance where Kennedy hurts Trump in a place like North Carolina, because you have a lot of military veterans live in North Carolina, and they may not like his foreign policy, but they can't bring themselves to vote for Biden. Then again, Kennedy's place on the ballot could be a huge problem for Biden in a place like Michigan, a large Arab American population, who may decide, I can't vote for Trump. No way I'm voting for Trump, but I'm going to send a message over here. So I think Kennedy is sitting there as sort of the default none of the above. And I often joke if he were a little less weird, and let's just be honest, he just does not come across, and I'll just use the word odd to be friendly. I think he'd be probably sitting at 30% in the polls. I mean, it's pretty clear the country is hungry for they are willing to test drive any car at this point. Really? Sure, I'll try it. And if he makes the debate stage, boy, then, I don't think it's clear who it hurts or helps. I actually think I actually think the person who really needs Kennedy on the debate stage more than anybody is Biden. I think if you put Kennedy on the debate stage, Kennedy becomes a story. And Biden's very sketchy ability to do public debates like this is sort of less there. And, Kennedy has his own voice issues. So, and it comes across, and he sounds very meek sometimes in his voice. That actually would be beneficial for Biden, who, at times doesn't come across as the strongest communicator. If there's a much weaker communicator on stage than him, he may benefit by comparison.
Just finally, Chuck, I mean, you have this term unprecedented often bandied around about the times we live in. I just wonder if there is a historical parallel with this election. Is it 1968 all over again, where you have huge popular outrage among a certain section of the population, by no means all over a foreign war, then Vietnam, now Gaza, where you have a Republican bogeyman in the wings, then Nixon, now Trump. And of course, back in 1968, it all came to a head with scenes of chaotic violence at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Where's the convention this time? Chicago. Is it 68 all over again?
So, look, Americans are not involved in the war in Gaza, right? And it's a huge difference. I also want to remind folks, if you look at where these campus protests are happening, they're happening where we have large Arab American populations or where there are large Muslim populations. New York, D.C., Michigan, Los Angeles, and the Bay Area. In 68, famously, we had an incident at Kent State in Ohio. It was very much, that's not the Ivy League. That's not, Berkeley. And that was a moment because you were like, if it's happening at Kent State, I mean, it is happening at every campus. It's not happening at Kent State. I just picked up my oldest at the University of Miami. They've not had a single incident at all. Now, Miami happens to not have Miami's a hugely diverse city, not a very large Arab American population, not a very large Muslim population. Maybe that's it. Now, and I do think, like, why did D.C. schools have it? Why did New York? It's, so I do think that's why I pull back a little bit there. But the 68 comparisons, I think it was a major cultural change that was taking place in America. 68 arguably is our first presidential election where everybody had the right to vote. People forget that. It's our first. We've been trying to do something for 250 years, right? Have a multi-ethnic democracy, but it wasn't until 68 that everybody had access to that democracy and was voting then. So if you think about the cultural and in many ways, the debate we were having in 68, who's an American, what's America, where should America be? It was really about identity, right? And who defined patriotism, who defined the American identity. It's not dissimilar to what happened during our Civil War, not dissimilar to what happened. I actually think this current period we live in, if you just look at it, it's more similar to the end of the 19th century in the post-Civil War era. We had 5 straight presidential elections that were decided by 5 points or less. We had one that took the courts. It was disputed. By the way, we had a president lose re-election, come back and win re-election. All in that period I'm describing, 1868 to 1892. And we are living in that same period. Well, we actually have a lot in common with that period back then. We were moving into a new industrial age. Back then, we were going from an agrarian economy, industrial economy. Women's rights people were wondering, when are women going to get equal rights? That was at the time was moving up. So I would argue we're sort of 68 is similar in that cultural respect, but I actually think it is we're almost relitigating Reconstruction. We're relitigating our post-Civil War because we never did it then, right? In some ways, we swept it all under the rug and moved on, got consumed by outside events, got consumed by industrial success, then the couple of world wars, and in some ways, and then the Cold War, and all of that papered over some of our identity clashes. And now they're back, and we have a changing economy, right? With this global economy that's doing all this. Plus, we have a changing media environment. We had a changing media environment back in the late 19th century too. So, I actually, to be kind of a history dork, I do find myself gravitating more to the Grover Cleveland elections than I am to the Richard Nixon elections.
Chuck, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on Times Radio.
James, I enjoyed it. Anytime.